now we're going to shift gears and look at where the smart money is placing long-term bets in the Solana ecosystem. The three firms that's going to come present on stage have all collectively backed some of the most iconic companies, both on the infrastructure and application layer across the crypto ecosystem. Rockaway, LocalGlobeVC, and Fabric Ventures are three different VCs who are Europe domiciled and have a great network here and have been very actively investing in the space. Would love to welcome them to the stage and share with us their perspective, what they're excited about investing-wise and building-wise. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I think I'm moderating this one, but hopefully it'll be kind of more interactive than that. I will loosen my tie. First of all, quickly, what kind of people have we got in the audience? I mean, it's a fantastic audience and a lot of great chats going on here. Have we got founders? Can we put hands up? Kind of like 20%. Allocators of some description? 5%, whatever. Commentators, pundits, users. Okay, speculators, fine. Mixture. So, as it says up there, I'm Richard Muirhead from Fabric. I don't think we'll go very long, so we'll pile right in. I think my kind of micro intro is just going to be that, as has been said many times already, just in the last few sessions, we're entering, another, inflection point in this industry that we love. And a shift, I guess, particularly in the Solana ecosystem from just sort of trumpeting, we're fast, to kind of, we actually can have auditable and fair execution, transactions and the order of, finality can actually be protected and private, all of the things that are required to really get the high levels of comfort for execution for, internet capital markets and machine-driven capital markets. And that's important. We're actually in a courthouse, and 300 years ago or 250 years ago, in one single year, they sent 200 people to Australia for as convicts. And at that time, if you did a bad trade, they had to clamp down on it pretty fast and do that. And for those who don't know, I'm actually Australian originally, but I didn't, or none of my ancestors actually suffered that fate. So on that note, I will pass over to Samantha to introduce herself and then pass to Julian.
I'm glad you've loosened the news. And maybe the first thing I'll say is Richard's kind of organized this conversation as the moderator, but he clearly has a lot to say. So I'm going to keep throwing it back so that this is just the three of us letting it fly for the next 15 minutes. I'm Samantha. I'm with Rockaway. We run a few strategies in digital assets. So one, venture, and then we run a market neutral or credit. And so out of that, we've been, I think we're talking on-chain capital, so we've been kind of a client of a lot of this on-chain capital infrastructure because we provide liquidity to protocols. We've done that for over 4 years. And so that's sometimes participating in TVL programs that bootstrap new applications. Sometimes it's acting as a solver, so kind of an on-chain market maker and getting compensated for that. Sometimes it's stuff that looks more like private credit. So it's a loan to a borrower that's you're underwriting risk in the same way you would if it was bilateral as a private, like a lending desk would, but you're doing it on an on-chain platform. I see we have Camino here, so it's sometimes vaults and putting capital into those for fixed yield. So fixed yield return is the mandate. It's not speculative. And then anyway, the point of that is we went from kind of being the client of all this stuff to, in the last year, getting into the business of creating those products. So that's the vault curation, which I think there's a few panels on later. I see a few of the speaker stars glittering around. So yeah, we've started doing that, and that to me means creating these actively managed or funds essentially that live on chain.
Very nice to be here. I'm Julian. I'm with LocalGlobe. I don't know how many of you, if any of you, have heard of LocalGlobe, but we've been doing this a little bit of time. We've been doing it about 25 years, which if you sit on the West Coast, is not very long. If you sit in London, it's a while. If you went to a dinner party in 2003 and said you invest in tech startups, it was pretty lonely. I think there was a lot of, can you not get a real job? But, a few years on, it turns out there are some great entrepreneurs here. And those great entrepreneurs have built really big companies. And from that, succeeded the next generation of entrepreneurs. And we've been fortunate to back some people far more talented than ourselves. We've done this through the cycles from e-commerce way back when, that Goldman Sachs report that speculated one day 10% of commerce might happen online, which seemed a wild, fantastical assumption or imagination, but obviously today it's surpassed it. And we invested through the fintech cycle, which obviously was a sort of nice nurturing ground for us today as we think about what's happening in the world of blockchain. But we're seed investors in Wise, we're in Monzo, we're in a number of other companies which not only have themselves had to think pretty hard about what comes next, but has also spun out a number of founders that are doing really important things in the blockchain space today as they too think what's next. And we've been fortunate to back companies specifically in blockchain like Copper on the custody side. We're investors in a business called Ostium, which is doing perps for real world assets, is doing incredibly well. But we are generalists, so we maybe come at it from a slightly different angle, which is we think pretty practically, I think, about the world. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thanks, Julian. So I started building a company 10 years before LocalGlobe started and knew the founder, Saul, back then. But I'm not going to tell you all about that because it definitely dates me. But what I thought we'd do is try and have a conversation about a little bit the intersection between that generalist approach and the kind of emerging capabilities of all L1, well, many L1 blockchains, but in particular of Solana. I do think that the new era that I referred to earlier, in some sense, we characterized as this shift from competing, on feeds and speeds, and to be a dominant L1 of some description, to really taking much more attention or paying much more attention to the particular requirements of certain use cases, how to get, make institutions happy, how to make regulators happy, how to make sure trades execute fairly, and so forth. And that's what I definitely see in the kind of roadmap. My particular perspective, again, without going back through the decades, but just a half a decade, is that I was on the NEAR Foundation Council for NEAR Protocol for 6 years. I've just hopped off and I'm on Sovereign, still in the board, they're still in the ecosystem. But so I witnessed that battle for L1 supremacy that took place. And obviously Solana has done tremendously well in that kind of broad sense. But I also now seeing all of the good work that's happening to be the place that you want to see these transactions be settled. And how that, I think the intersection comes, and how that is going to support this shift to agentic commerce, or it's definitely in the buzzword category right now. I was just talking to politicians about the questions like, how do we prepare for agentic? What can the government do? It's definitely pretty buzzwordy when that happens. That's also my excuse for my tie. But I think it's a valid point, because if you come from Julian's perspective, you've seen outfits like Wise and Monzo build up and innovate in terms of fintech to some degree, if I can put it this way, putting lipstick on the financial services pig, and not really rebuilding anything from the core. And we've always thought, actually, at Fabric over the last decade, the opportunity was actually to innovate from the core, to bring in stable coins and do something fundamentally different. And now that's coinciding, that's intersecting with AI and agents. I think there's plenty of opportunity there. So either of you want to opine on where we are with that? Are the X402 transactions on Solana real? That's my first question.
Look, I was having a conversation with a founder who we backed. Let's call it a sort of pre-IPO PSP, $1 billion+ in revenues, growing 50% year on year, and was having this very conversation with him last week. And we were having the discussion around, stable coins and, You know, where are the use cases? And like, he is maniacally focused on agentic commerce and making sure that he is the de facto infrastructure provider for when it happens. And you know, it does feel a little bit buzzwordy, you know, AI, but you know, it is in literally every builder's like lexicon right now. What does it mean? What are the agentic use cases? And that's going to need infrastructure. And so, you know, what it means, I think, more specifically, if you sort of start to break down where, you know, on the B2B side, that's where we see a huge amount of potential, both with cross-border as well as just enabling reconciliation in like very transparent ways. It's shocking how bad the underlying cross-border payments infrastructure and reconciliation looks like. I mean, to be blunt, if you know, the real output, whether we like it or not, of AI is, you know, looking at huge shifts in labor. The labor that sits behind that reconciliation process is massive, but frankly, highly unproductive. And so, you know, that will happen, and that's going to happen over 12 to 18 months. This isn't a 5 to 10 years out type scenario. Now, where he, this founder, plus also we, are probably a little bit less bullish is maybe on the B2C side, where there's actually lots of very good infrastructure, where there's consumer protections around it, and maybe the direct use case, like that, the why now, is less relevant. But it's kind of interesting. If you think about what's basically happening, one would be a rip and replace on the B2C side. On the agentic side, it's just wide open space. There is no particular solution for that. And so that's where we start to think about, like, what are the new motions, and how can that be relevant, or how can blockchain solutions be relevant to those? And that starts to become quite relevant, where you think of, like, you know, a solution which needs a technology rather than the other way around.
Yeah, so I think, first of all, because you mentioned Wise earlier as one of your early bets, I'd be curious. I've been thinking where Wise does fit in here, because, and I actually say that from an earlier, like a stock trading nerd hat. I think Wise is a really underpriced stock from like a value, and yet I say that not knowing, I should be more feeling it's going to be displaced by something stable if they're not doing it already. But, oh, sorry, do you want to?
No, you just bring up such a good point there.
Yeah.
Because, so he lives in Austin. He's one of the best CTOs we've ever worked with. I've literally been having this conversation with Harsh, who's the CTO at Wise, for about 5 or 6 years. And we have gone back and forth on this. And the house view for Wise, which is a very valid one, is if you can do cables, so, you know, sterling dollar, for about 26 basis points, you know, what is the blockchain use case for that for the majority of transactions? And in reality, it's kind of hard to make a really good use case for that. But when it's in the hundreds of basis points, in, you know, much less liquid, you know, transaction or FX corridors, that's where it starts to look really, really interesting. And look, you only have to look at the roadmap of Stripe right now to really understand where those deep seams are. And, you know, that's a really relevant one. But the interesting question for Wise is, okay, TradFlyer player, you know, where do you want to play in that? You obviously have brand, you have distribution.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly a conundrum if you're kind of a new incumbent like that, because you don't want to acknowledge the potential of the disruptive technology too early, for obvious reasons, especially if you've listed, and we were also early in Wise, as you know, and use them, and the founders as an investor. So we're all tight with the guys and want them to be successful. Indubitably, they have value in their user interface and the engagement, and the trust with the regulators and the consumer and so forth. That's value. But under the hood, it may be that there's a further margin that can be eroded from Forex, and so therefore that's an opportunity for them. But it also, what I see is if you look at, for example, Kraken becoming a close partner with NASDAQ for, 24/7, 365 trading of equities that are tokenized and other assets. If you look at architectures like in the intense architecture, where you've got a serious amount of abstraction above, different underlying chains and resident digital assets, it's only any time now that you will be able to bring that kind of approach to foreign exchange, and you'll be able to just, build that into your application or build a new consumer application. So, but that wasn't possible around, should we say, USD denominated stablecoins or any other stablecoin until we had obviously the Genius Act and you had some regulatory acceptance. It was always going to be on the fringes. And so I suspect, it sounds like you would know better, that the CTO of Wise has been brewing up a position, a strategy that might become public, round about now.
It's going to become public right now. You heard it, not in Austin, but
I'm certainly not going to pre-announce any Wise product roadmap.
Should I be
but
buying more?
It's worth a try.
The industrial logic does make sense.
I think outside of the regulatory and the just where are the cost savings identified, there's also just been a UX problem. So if you're going to sell, and to your point on, okay, is the B2C there, right? The B2B for wholesale FX is really, there's some interesting companies. Actually, one that exited last year of my was Asa Finance, that too, was always really early in using stablecoin and digital assets for wholesale FX in Africa. But on the B2C question, to make someone do something, it has to be cheaper, faster, easier, any sale, cheaper, easier, save them money, time, or a better experience. And I think the better experience has been elusive. Maybe not because of the chain, the infrastructure, but just because of all the apps that you have to interact with to use this stuff, to put it plainly. I think that's where Stripe is really interesting as an example, which is, these companies that have become generational because they got both the tech and the, I don't know, in that case UX, but more the outreach, the developer engagement and all of that. Are they the ones that can make all this mainstream? And so I think putting stables in Link Wallet is a huge change. I often find myself thinking even that they're willing to do that in the face of Visa and MasterCard, why? Because I don't know why they would want that, but clearly they think that at least what's to gain, or at least being not the first mover, but being a mover is sufficient enough that they should start.
There's another angle on the B2C part, which I think is sometimes overlooked, which is just the experiential parts on the part of the consumer. So we're investors in a business called Fuse Energy, which is a sort of new household energy provider. It's actually on Solana building a token, which hasn't been launched yet. But it's really interesting. They're effectively giving households the opportunity to be a part of a sort of distributed energy network. And the sort of experiential upside of that, where you can look at your solar generation at home, you can look at your EV if you charge it at the right times, you can think about your peak usage, and then you can think about a sort of tradable instrument. Now, don't call it a token when you're selling it to my parents. I guarantee that's not a good idea. But the experience off the back of that is just so interesting.
I'm always astonished. I must admit, have we been cut off? Have I been cut off? I'm still a little bit amused by the countdown because A, I can't see it, and B, I'm not sure whether it's going up and down. But the rest in politics with Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell. They advertised Fuse Energy on it, maybe to your mother actually, on the podcast with great regularity. So I'm thrilled to see something that is a real world use case becoming mainstream, almost with a token, running on Solana, and that's fantastic. But I guess the point in that is that I think you might be making, but tell me if I'm wrong, is that it's okay for the use of all this technology to be extremely varied. And that, just solve the problem you need to solve at the top end, whether it's kind of a better proposition around energy or a better proposition around ride hailing or a better proposition around, managing a supply chain. And in the back, a lot of things are going to happen. And I don't think that we need, I actually think that we'll approach a kind of a flipping or flippening or point, the big flip, when most of the transactions in the world are going to take place between machines, between agents, and so the kind of B2C element, those interactions with finance are going to be much more limited. Should be. I mean, that's the idea. We don't want to spend our time playing with money, do we? We want to spend our time living or solving problems, and the money just needs to kind of fade into the background. That's kind of the objective. Even though at the moment it feels sometimes like finance is the use case for crypto that has been sort of flying around crypto Twitter, and sometimes, of course, especially in the Solana community, say it's finance is a use case, and the answer is just Solana, and that's good. Everybody's got to trumpet their wares, but I think that it's not that is just the use case. That's the only use case. It's the fact that that is a horizontal. That's a set of capabilities that stretches across every use case, and that's where we're sort of skating to. Yeah. Do you want your mic back?
No, I think you nailed it, but I was going to say, I think it's what you're saying is just it's a coordination layer. And in finance, there's been so many frictions just with banks, I guess, in many ways being very staid in their cross-border offerings and all of this, that the need for better coordination is obvious. But yes, there's others too, right? Whether it's distributed energy networks, or, I don't know, I've seen cybersecurity coordination stuff that's interesting.
I think that's right, and it's actually something which Joseph mentioned at the beginning. I actually wrote this phrase down. Joseph said, the technology has been adopted. And actually, I agree with that. You know, we did not, I'll be honest, we did not invest into Fuse to invest into a distributed energy network. We thought that they had the potential to do something actually on their software layer in like a fully integrated energy business, which was really substantial. But once you've done that, then the opportunity to layer in this technology, which is, you know, it's kind of a second order, you know, priority really, a distributed energy network compared to the much more pragmatic use cases we've been talking about. I think that just really speaks to where we are and also what comes next.
On that note, I think we need to wrap because we're over time. And thank you very much for listening, and hope to chat to some of you later.